She was just 7, lying in the dirt, cold, broken, the life nearly gone from her small body. He thought he'd finished her. He thought no one would ever know, but she was still breathing. And that changed everything. She was just 7 years old, small, fragile. Her pink roller skates lying a few feet away in the dirt. The night air was cold against her skin, her breath shallow, her heartbeat almost gone. He had dragged her here, left her here, certain no one would find her until it was far too late. Certain that the last sound she'd ever hear was the wind moving through the trees above her. He thought it was over. He thought she would never speak again. Never tell anyone what he had done. He thought his secret was safe under the cover of darkness. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that somewhere inside her battered, broken body, a spark was still burning. She was still breathing. She was still alive. And that changed everything. Because the moment she opened her eyes, the countdown began. The countdown to the day the world would learn his name. The day the truth would crawl out of the woods and find him, to understand what happened to her in 1990. You have to go back to a crisp autumn evening in 1986. Brighton, England. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids played outside until the streetlights came on. 9-year-old Nicola Fellows and her best friend Karen Hadaway were no different. That night, they laughed their way down narrow sidewalks, sneakers slapping against the pavement, voices carrying in the cool air. They told their parents they'd be close to home. They promised they'd be back soon. They never were. When they didn't come home, it didn't take long for the worry to set in. Parents called out their names into the dark. Neighbors stepped out onto porches, peering into the night. The police were called, and within hours, search parties formed. The search led to a place locals knew well, Wild Park, a sprawling wooded area on the edge of the city. In daylight, it was a playground for nature walks and weekend picnics. At night, it was another world. The kind of place where shadows seemed heavier, where every crunch of leaves underfoot made you stop and listen. Volunteers moved in lines, flashlights sweeping through the undergrowth. Police dogs picked up scents, leading officers deeper into the cold, damp woods. The smell of wet earth hung in the air, heavy, still. And then, a shout. Under a dense canopy of trees, not far from a well-worn footpath, 2 small bodies were found. Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, lying side by side. They were just 9 years old. The community's heartbreak was instant, and it was raw. Parents clutched their own children tighter. Neighbors wept openly. The girls' families were shattered. Their world reduced to questions no parent should ever have to ask. And police? They moved fast. Within days, a suspect emerged, a local man named Russell Bishop. He was known in the area. He'd been seen near the park. And soon, he was sitting in an interview room across from detectives. Evidence was gathered. Fibers, witness statements, timelines pieced together. The pressure was immense. The public demanded justice, and it looked like they might get it. The case went to trial. Families filled the courtroom, clinging to hope. But when the verdict came, it wasn't what they expected. The evidence wasn't enough. And the man accused of killing 2 little girls walked out of court a free man. The courtroom was silent, except for the judge's voice. Families leaned forward in their seats, every muscle tight. The parents of Nicola and Karen held hands, gripping as if the verdict itself could shatter them. Then the words came, "Not guilty." For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of paper shuffling, the echo of footsteps. And then, a sob, a mother's voice breaking in a way that makes everyone else in the room go still. The sound of a father's grief turning to disbelief. Russell Bishop stood. The man accused of killing 2 9-year-old girls turned toward the doors, and he smiled. That smile would stay burned into the memories of everyone there. Outside, the reaction was immediate, and it was raw. Reporters shouted questions. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. In living rooms across Brighton, people shook their heads at their televisions. In pubs, men slammed their fists on the bar, muttering words you wouldn't want a child to hear. How could this happen? How could there be 2 little girls dead in the woods, and no one held accountable? The jury had spoken, but to the families, to the community, justice had not been served. Police officers who had worked the case stood in the hallway, stunned. They'd built the timeline. They'd found the fibers. They'd seen the way Bishop's eyes had darted when certain questions were asked. But the law is the law. and the evidence, the jury decided, wasn't enough. And so, Russell Bishop, the man whose name had been whispered in fear, the man parents told their children to stay away from, walked out into the daylight, free. And here's the thing about a man who's been accused of something this dark, and walks away without consequence: he doesn't disappear. He blends back in. He keeps living. He keeps watching. 3 years later, another little girl would cross his path. It was a warm summer afternoon in 1990. The kind of day when kids didn't want to be indoors. 7-year-old Rachael Watts laced up her pink roller skates and stepped outside, the sun catching in her hair, her laughter carrying down the quiet Brighton street. She was just a child, small, full of life, skating lazy circles near her home, the wheels clacking softly over the uneven pavement. To her, the world was safe, familiar, predictable, but someone else was watching. From a distance, Russell Bishop spotted her. To most passers-by, it would have looked like nothing, just another man on the street. But Bishop wasn't just passing by. He was studying her, watching her patterns, watching how no adult was nearby. He had done this before. Slowly, he closed the distance. His voice was friendly, casual, the kind adults sometimes use to make a child feel at ease. He said something that made her pause. Maybe it was about her skates. Maybe it was a question she didn't see as dangerous. That's how it starts. Rachael would later remember fragments, being close to his car, hearing the sound of the door, feeling the moment when everything familiar fell away. Once she was inside, the tone shifted. The streets of her neighborhood disappeared behind them as Bishop drove, steering further and further from safety. The houses grew sparse, trees pressed in. The smell of the sea gave way to the damp, earthy scent of the countryside. He drove for miles, heading toward a place no one would think to look. The road narrowed, gravel crunching under the tires. Tall grass scraped the sides of the car. Then he pulled off, into a remote spot shielded by thick woodland. This wasn't a place you stumbled onto by accident. This was a place you chose, if you didn't want to be found. The car stopped. The air felt different here, heavier, isolated. And in that moment, whatever innocence remained was about to be stripped away. She was 7 years old. She would never be the same. But she would live. Her woods were quiet. Too quiet. Somewhere deep in that remote clearing, far from the houses and playgrounds she knew, 7-year-old Rachael Watts stood frozen, her small frame casting a faint shadow in the fading light. Russell Bishop's voice was no longer friendly. It was sharp, controlled, the kind of voice that tells you there's no point in running. What happened next can't be undone. It can't be softened. In those minutes, Rachael's childhood was taken from her. The trees around them seemed to close in. No one could hear her. No one even knew she was here. When it was over, Bishop stepped back. He looked at her, this tiny broken child lying on the cold ground, and made a choice. A choice that, to him, felt final. He didn't call for help. He didn't take her home. He left her there. The dirt was damp beneath her cheek. The air chilled her skin. She could feel the earth pressing in, hear the rustle of leaves overhead. Her breaths were shallow, the kind that make it seem like life is slipping away. Bishop turned and walked back to his car. Gravel shifted under his shoes, the sound of his footsteps fading with each step. He didn't look back. In his mind, she was already gone. The engine started. Tires crunched over the dirt track as he drove away, the sound growing fainter until there was only silence. But Rachael wasn't finished yet. For a long time there was only darkness. Rachael lay there, still, the cold ground beneath her, the taste of dirt in her mouth. Every breath was a fight, a thin, fragile thread keeping her tied to this world. Then, somewhere deep inside, something shifted. A thought, a will, a small voice that said, "Get up." It wasn't easy. Her limbs felt heavy. Her head pounded. But she moved, inch by inch, dragging herself through the dirt, away from the place he had left her. The air was sharp in her lungs, the scent of damp leaves filling her nose. Every sound in the woods felt louder, each crack of a twig making her heart race. Somewhere in the distance, there was another sound, a voice, faint at first, carried by the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to push her forward. A passerby, moving along a nearby trail, stopped. Something had caught their eye, a flash of movement where there shouldn't have been any. They stepped closer. and saw her, a child, barely conscious, battered, her clothes torn, her face pale. Within minutes, police and paramedics were there. Flashlights cut through the trees. Radios crackled. Gentle hands lifted her onto a stretcher. The cool, sterile smell of the ambulance replaced the damp scent of the forest. At the hospital, the scene shifted from urgency to quiet precision. Doctors worked quickly. Nurses cleaned and bandaged her wounds. Detectives stood at the edge of the room, watching, waiting. Her clothes were carefully placed into evidence bags. Every fiber, every speck of dirt, now part of a puzzle that could expose a predator. When she spoke, softly, haltingly, officers leaned in. Each word was recorded, each detail another piece of the case. Rachael was alive. And with her survival came something Bishop never planned for, a witness. This time, the case wouldn't slip away. The courtroom in 1990 was packed. Reporters filled the benches, their pens poised over notepads. The air was heavy, not just with the smell of polished wood and old paper, but with the unspoken weight of what everyone knew this day meant. At the center of it all sat Rachael Watts, 7 years old. So small her feet barely touched the floor beneath the witness stand. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white. She wore her best dress, one chosen by her family to give her strength. She was about to do something no child should ever have to do. Tell a room full of strangers, with her attacker sitting just feet away, exactly what happened to her in the woods. The judge's voice was calm, but firm. The jury leaned in. The defense shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Rachael began. She spoke in short sentences, her words careful. She told them about the man who stopped her, the way he spoke, the car ride, the trees. She described the ground beneath her when she woke up alone. At times, she paused, her small brow furrowing as if reaching back through a fog of pain and fear. At other times, her eyes flicked toward Bishop, not in defiance, but in the way a survivor will glance at the shadow of something that once tried to destroy them. The courtroom listened. No one interrupted. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the fibers, the forensic matches, the medical testimony. Piece by piece, they built the story of a man who thought he could take a child's life and vanish back into the crowd. When the jury returned, the room went still. The foreman's voice was steady. Guilty. Russell Bishop was convicted of kidnapping and attempted murder. The sentence was life in prison. For Rachael's family, it was a moment of relief. For the police who had carried the weight of the case, it was vindication. But for the families of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, the two 9-year-old girls found in Wild Park just 4 years earlier, it was something else entirely. They knew the man convicted today was the same man who had once stood trial for their daughter's murders. They knew what he had taken from them. And yet, no justice had come for Nicola and Karen. Bishop would go to prison. But for those two families, justice was still a stranger. And years passed. Seasons changed. The Wild Park murders, Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, became a cold case file gathering dust in the Brighton police archives. But it never really went away. Not for the detectives who had worked it. Not for the families who woke up every day with the same empty space at the table. And not for the community that had learned the hard way that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they walk among you. By the early 2000s, something new was on the horizon. A quiet revolution in crime fighting. DNA technology. What had once been blurry, inconclusive evidence in the late 1980s could now be examined in microscopic detail. It was like someone had suddenly turned on a light in a room that had been dark for decades. Cold case detectives pulled the babes in the wood file from storage. Inside were the original crime scene photos, the fibers, the clothing, and, most importantly, preserved biological samples. They were sent to modern labs, places with machines that could detect genetic markers invisible to the human eye. The testing took time. Weeks stretched into months. Detectives didn't say much, not even to the families. But behind closed doors, hope began to grow. And then, the results came back. There was no mistake. The DNA matched. It was Russell Bishop, the same man who had walked free in 1987. The same man who had attacked and left 7-year-old Rachael Watts for dead. The same man serving a life sentence for that attack, but who, until now, had never been held accountable for the murders of Nicola and Karen. Detectives gathered in a briefing room, the air thick with a mix of vindication and fury. They had waited more than 2 decades for this moment, and now, with the science to back it up, they could finally move. Arrest warrants were signed. Plans were made. The door that Bishop thought had been shut forever was about to be kicked wide open. And this time, he couldn't run. It was the winter of 2018, more than 30 years after two 9-year-old girls, Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, had gone out to play and never come home. The courtroom looked different now. New faces filled the jury box, younger officers lined the back wall. But for the families in the front row, nothing about the pain felt old. They were here to watch a man they had known too well face the truth he'd outrun for decades. Russell Bishop sat at the defense table, older now. Prison years had added lines to his face, but his eyes, those same cold, flat eyes, hadn't changed. The prosecution wasted no time. They walked the jury back to 1986, brick by brick. Photographs of the wooded clearing where the girls were found. Maps showing the short walk from their homes to Wild Park. The preserved evidence, fibers, hairs, biological samples, each one a piece of a puzzle that had once seemed impossible to finish. Then came the science. Forensic experts explained the DNA testing, breaking down decades of technological progress into terms the jury could understand. They showed the match, precise, undeniable, absolute. The families watched in silence. Some held hands so tightly, their knuckles went white. Others stared straight ahead, as if looking anywhere else might weaken their resolve. There was testimony from police officers who had worked the original case, men and women now older, grayer, but still carrying the weight of their failure to convict him the first time. They told the jury what it was like to watch him walk free in 1987. And then, they told them how it felt to finally have the evidence to bring him back. The defense tried to cast doubt. They questioned the handling of evidence, the memories of witnesses. But the tide had turned. The science didn't lie, and neither did the pattern of his crimes. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Hours later, they filed back in. The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to press down on your chest. The foreman stood. The judge asked the question. On the charge of the murder of Nicola Fellows, guilty. On the charge of the murder of Karen Hadaway, guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment, almost too heavy to fall. And then, quiet sobs from the families. Not the uncontrolled grief of 1986, but the long, exhausted release of people who had been holding their breath for 32 years. Russell Bishop was sentenced to life in prison. This time, there would be no walking free, no loopholes, no second chances. He was going away for good. In January of 2022, word spread quietly through the prison system: Russell Bishop was dead. The man who had taken 2 young lives in 1986 and who had tried to take another in 1990 would never see daylight again. For many, his death was simply the end of a name that had haunted headlines for decades. But for one person, it was something more. For the first time in over 30 years, Rachael Watts, the 7-year-old girl who had survived him, decided to speak publicly. She was no longer a child, no longer just a case file or a blurred photograph in a newspaper. She was a woman with her own voice, and after decades of silence, she was ready to use it. Sitting before the camera, her voice steady, she chose her words carefully. "I'm happy I survived, and I was able to protect others." It was more than a statement. It was a truth forged in pain and carried through the years. Surviving wasn't just about breathing, it was about living in a world where his shadow had once loomed, and choosing every day not to let it define her. She talked about the numbness she had felt for years, the way the memories could still arrive uninvited, like fragments of a nightmare. But she also spoke about strength, not the kind that roars, but the kind that gets up in the morning, again and again, even when the weight is heavy. For the families of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, Bishop's death and Rachel's words were the final chapters in a story that had stolen so much. The justice had come late, and it could never return what was lost, but it had come. And in the end, the last word didn't belong to him. It belonged to the girl who wouldn't stay silent. The girl who had been left in the dirt and refused to die there. The girl who grew into a woman unafraid to face the past. Bishop's story ended in a prison cell. Rachel's is still being written. Well, and justice can be delayed. It can be denied. It can be buried under years of legal failures, faded memories, and unanswered questions. But sometimes, against all odds, the truth survives, just like she did. For over 3 decades, the shadow of Russell Bishop hung over Brighton. For 32 years, the families of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway waited for the day the truth would be spoken out loud in a courtroom. And for more than half her life, Rachael Watts carried the weight of what happened to her in the woods, knowing that her survival had stopped a killer from taking even more. When Bishop died in 2022, it was the end of his story, but not the end of theirs. The families still grieve. The scars don't vanish. But the truth now has a place in history that no one can erase. In the end, it wasn't the killer's voice that echoed through time. It was hers, the voice of a woman who had every reason to hide, but instead chose to be heard. On-screen text, dedicated to the memories of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway, and to the bravery of survivor Rachael Watts. For more stories where the truth fights back, subscribe, because the next case might just change the law again.